welcome everyone. My name is Corey Donovan. I'm a co-founder of Impact PHL. We are an impact investing and values-aligned investing advocacy organization here in the Philadelphia region, encouraging investors to align their financial assets with their values. Thanks for joining us for our March edition of Impact PHL Conversations focused on AI and how it will affect local communities. I'm pretty excited about this topic myself. Pretty interesting program, so I'll hand things over to Lawrence here in a minute to guide us through this conversation, but I have a couple of housekeeping items before we kick off. First and foremost, I want to thank our funders and our sponsors, the people who help us run the organization here with the lifeblood that is contributions. So thanks again to our sponsors. We couldn't do this work without them. Also want to highlight a couple of other events we have coming up. Our April webinar is focused on employee ownership and how it might be critical to saving local businesses and how capital plays a role in that. So that'll be coming up April 9th. And then we have Total Impact Summit coming up on May 13th and 14th. If you use the code ECO26, it'll save you $600 off your ticket purchase. And heads up, we will be announcing the agenda for that on Wednesday this coming week. I'm pretty excited about the agenda. If you saw the email we put out earlier about some of the speakers we have confirmed, it's a star-studded cast. So I'm pretty excited about that. Just a reminder that we're recording this session, so you can always reference it later. If you hear anything that's interesting to you, that you think one of your peers, one of your board members, one of your colleagues needs to hear, it'll be permanently part of our library on the website. And going to remind you to put your questions in the chat as you hear things. I'm hoping there are quite a few questions from today's conversation, and we will moderate the questions that way. With that, I'll turn things over to Lawrence to guide the conversation today. Thanks again for joining us.
Of course. Thanks, Corey. So welcome, everybody. My name is Lawrence Williams, and welcome to Stewarding Capital in the Age of AI and an Investor's Role in Philadelphia's Future. And kind of what we've kind of put together here is the obvious, right? AI is no longer a side experiment. It's quickly becoming embedded in how companies operate and how services get delivered. And as these systems get more and more powerful and widespread, we need to be conscious about how responsible we are for AI and it becoming a core risk management, financial risk, legal risk, reputational risk, and real world human impact, right? So for investors, this is a stewardship moment. We shape outcomes through what we fund, what we require, and governance and disclosure, and how we engage with companies. So today we're going to kind of explore three different topics, kind of name the harms and bad outcomes that we're already seeing, especially at the individual and community level, to talk about what actually moves the needle, governance, data, privacy, accountability, and guardrails. And then we'll get practical about what investors can do right now in Philadelphia and get more of the good outcomes and fewer of the bad ones. So with that being said, I would love to introduce our two panelists here, Audrey and Catherine, if you guys want to just give a intro.
Sure, I can jump in. My name is Audrey Mokle, and I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Open Mic. And Open Mic works with investors on a wide range of responsible technology issues, both digital technologies and emerging tech. And as you can imagine, AI is a really big part of our work.
And I'm Catherine Bracey. I'm the founder and CEO of Tech Equity. Tech Equity is an organization based in California that works on issues at the intersection of tech and economic equity. And in those areas, we focus on labor issues, affordability issues, and issues related to corporate power. We're doing sort of research-based advocacy. So we work in Sacramento trying to affect state legislation. And we anchor a statewide network of public interest organizations who are bringing the voice of the public into the conversation about how to regulate AI in California. But as we know, especially on issues related to tech, what happens in California does not stay in California. So we really look at how we can be planting a flag here that can set an example for the rest of the country and really globally on how we think about regulating AI. And relevant to this conversation, I'm also the author of a book called World Eaters: How Venture Capital is Cannibalizing the Economy. And I'm looking forward to talking about how investors can be a force for shaping technology to build the future that we want.
That's awesome. So why don't we start right there, right? So let's kind of frame the moment. Why investors? Why now? Like, what do investors need to most misunderstand about AI right now, and especially at the community level? Either one of you.
Audrey, why don't you start?
Sure. I think when thinking about the community level, it's really important to think about both the risks and the opportunities. And, as while there are kind of really promising applications of AI, we want to make sure that in applying AI to different kind of social problems or community benefit problems, that those risks are mitigated. And so I always, when I talk to investors about this, I always say at a very baseline, every organization, whether they are developing AI or deploying it, they need to have some kind of basic considerations at the organizational level. And one of them is governance. So board level oversight, high level responsible AI policies, and more finely tuned risk management frameworks. Ongoing auditing that references well regarded AI risk frameworks, and I'm happy to share some of those later on. Red teaming and training across the organization. Every single employee should have training on how to use AI responsibly. The other thing is that data matters. AI models are only as good as the data they're trained on. And algorithmic bias really does drive outcomes. And so if you're thinking about trying to benefit a particular community, you want to make sure that models are trained using data that well reflect those communities, and that the data is kind of validated to make sure that there isn't any underlying bias that could create negative outcomes. So, if you're looking for investment opportunities, look for model developers that acknowledge the issue of model bias for one, and take steps to reduce it. Another really important and related topic is that security and privacy are two sides of the same coin when it comes to AI. And generative AI in particular comes with a lot of security risks. And this can cause financial, operational, legal, regulatory, and reputational risks for the companies deploying it. But it also, at the same time, means that everyone's private data that may be connected to a particular AI model or a particular application will be at risk if there's a security breach. And so it's really important that security is taken seriously to kind of safeguard the privacy rights of community members. And that's especially important if this is like in a sensitive sector area like financial services or healthcare, where there's a lot of like really sensitive personal data. I would also recommend more on the kind of on the opportunity side, like look for opportunities to invest in a pro-human AI stack. So one that embraces transparency and accountability and human flourishing, and usually would offer a more kind of open source model as opposed to the kind of concentrated power that you're seeing in the small number of AI hyperscalers that are dominating the market today. And some amazing opportunities will be in assurance mechanism, certification, auditing, and oversight. And there may even be opportunities to kind of do blended finance where you can do some grant making early on, and then it turns into a more kind of traditional impact investment later. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm talking too much on this one point because I want to throw it to Catherine, but
No, definitely. I mean, I had a follow-up, but Catherine, if you have anything to add, please do.
You should ask your follow-up because I'm going to go in a completely different direction.
Well, okay. Well, I was going to follow up and ask you a little bit about the pro-human AI and what does that look like, and that's kind of what you were getting into. If you want to keep elaborating on that, and what the opposite looks like, but then also too, where do you see investors accidentally doing like extractive models, right? So you've got the pro-human side, but where do you see the mistake doing the opposite at?
yeah, so I think, the pro-human side is going to focus on, like I said, open source products that really value data governance, people being able to retain autonomy over their data, assurance, auditing, oversight. and that is designed using kind of what's being called loosely participatory models, so that the end users and the affected stakeholders from the products should be consulted at earlier stages of product design, and that the AI is designed with them in mind. And I'll say a note on that because there's some very interesting research, especially out of MIT, on the subject. And what they found is that AI that is designed using these participatory consultative approaches actually produce kind of more marketable tech tools, and that ultimately they get used more and they actually turn into kind of more productive outcomes. So it's kind of a win-win for founders and for investors, and of course for communities as well. So that's kind of where those are the kinds of things I would look toward. Where you should be wary is, like, to kind of reiterate what you said, like extractive models. So AI companies or projects that take people's data without compensating them, that don't take steps to protect private data, like sensitive personal information, that don't take security seriously, that don't take factualness and the impact on the information environment seriously. Generally you want to make sure that the organization is governed well, like they take responsible AI seriously, they take security seriously and safety seriously. Yeah, no, I think, without pointing fingers, I think some of the most dominant companies right now in the AI space are ones that are probably not doing it that well, if I'm being honest.
Okay. Catherine?
I'm happy to name names, but
Yeah, we can name names.
So I want to zoom out even further, and I know it's this is a conversation that we want to be focused on the local level, but I think the risk in focusing too close to the ground is that we start to think of all these problems as problems with the technology themselves. And I would argue that it is impossible to build responsible AI if we are not changing the context in which AI is being developed, and in particular the economic and policy context. So two aspects of that I think are really important. The first is just the monopoly power of the industry here. And Audrey, kind of referred to some of the model builders. All of the startups that you may be investing in, because I'm assuming that if you're on this call, you're probably not invested in one of the model builders, the foundation models, but are looking to invest in companies that are probably reliant on those models. That creates a huge amount of risk. I mean, the companies that are building on top of these models don't have control over what is being built into the bias that is embedded in the systems, as Audrey mentioned, the data that it's being trained on. And I will say, while there is a widespread lack of accountability and regulation around AI in general, there are still laws on the books around the sort of areas where AI tools are being built. So let's say, for example, an algorithmic-based tenant screening tool is still sort of subject to fair housing laws, right? So if you're funding a company in that space that's building on a model that has bias built into it, and a landlord is making a decision about how to rent to a tenant based on the output of that model, well, guess what? Like, the company that's building it and the landlord who are using it are exposed to the legal risk that comes with potentially disparate impact and discrimination against tenants who are members of protected classes. So the companies that are building on top of these models don't have control over what's being built into it, and because these are basically monopoly or oligopolies with just a handful of companies that can kind of drive market conditions, you really don't have control over the margins either. And I think if we're sort of assuming that AI companies are sort of software companies, but they're really building on top of extremely hardware intensive and infrastructure intensive technology, and the margins are going to be much smaller for companies like that. So I think these are just like things to take into account when we think about the overwhelming power that a handful of companies have in setting the market conditions for all the other startups who are trying to build in this space. And I think if you contrast that with the startup sector that grew up on top of the internet, which of course was developed funded by government and developed inside academic labs, intrinsic to the internet were a set of open principles that made it possible for everybody to build on top of it for almost no cost. And that those characteristics are really what made the startup environment so vibrant and created all of the economic opportunity that we saw from sort of the internet age. When you look at what we're building now with so much economic power being controlled by so few companies, even if we wanted to use that as a sort of foundation for a next generation cycle of economic growth, we're going to see a lot of that value be captured by those companies unless we do something about it. The second thing I would say is sort of the economic context that is creating the conditions on the ground that are sort of driving these harms or preventing us from building responsible AI is the logic of venture capital, which is really driving for hyper growth models that sort of move fast and break things, ask forgiveness, not permission, sort of operate with a blitzscaling mentality of sort of intentional thoughtlessness. And in venture capital's logic sort of optimizes for creating monopolies. And that logic is not really working for the vast majority of startups. I think we are now seeing how unlikely it is for there to be enough of the companies that get created every year that can actually drive those hyperscale returns for portfolios. And yet, almost every sort of investor is being forced to sort of pursue that logic, maybe because it's what founders are looking for, it's the patterns that limited partners are expecting. I think it's time for us to shake up that thinking and really look for approaches to investing that can be different from the traditional hyperscale power law type returns, and in concert, build the tools that will be required for us to test the hypothesis that it is possible to invest in innovative startups that can deliver high financial returns while also delivering the things that we need for society to really take advantage and be a part of the growth opportunity that AI is going to create.
And you said something interesting there that I want you to maybe touch on. You talked a little bit about the infrastructure costs, just about like what AI is going to cost us in terms of power, in terms of, uh, overall balance between the people. I was just wondering, like, in terms of if you're looking at it and back down at a local level, or at a countrywide level, when we're talking about trying to develop AI, how do you see the government's role in this? Because that's kind of what I was getting at with the power piece. How do you see government influence kind of over the whole AI building?
When you say power, do you mean like electrical power or
I was saying a little bit of both, a
well,
little bit of
economic
both.
power?
Sorry, I used that word liberally, but a little bit of both.
Okay, well, I mean, I think the first thing I would say, just on the to go one level deeper on the margins question, obviously software has very low, scaling costs, right? So, um, you can reach a much bigger audience for a relatively low cost once the software is already developed. With AI, the cost of tokens does not scale that way, right? So the more users you have, if you're building on top of one of these systems, the higher your costs are going to be. And so it's just to be clear that I think, I'm not sure that we've fully internalized the math there for some of these companies. And a lot of that right now, I think, is being hidden by um, investors being willing to burn cash in the way that they sort of funded companies like Uber that were money losing for a really long time. But I don't know how sustainable that is. So someone's going to have to like figure out, if you're growing your business as fast as investors expect you to, but your token costs are not coming down as you scale your reach, then ultimately the finances don't really work for me. But I'm not a finance person, so somebody else can correct me if they see a way around this. That just seems like a collision course that we may be on. In terms of regulatory power, I mean, I think this is another area where investors are exposed to a lot of risk that maybe they take for granted. In that, again, the companies that are building on top of these largely unregulated tools are still accountable for what they build and market. And they have very little insight or reassurance from the companies that these tools are actually safe. So, without a regulatory environment that's really creating a sort of safety standard across the industry, there's an enormous amount of risk being built into the system that is very hard for the companies that are building on top of these models to mitigate against on their own. The other aspect of sort of risk in an unregulated environment is that it drives a lack of mistrust in the technology overall. And I think we are seeing that now in the way that the public is really sort of coming online to their sense of what AI is or means for them, and it's not great. And that's not an that's not an environment that's really primed for huge market opportunities either. Like if your target audience does not trust the technology, you're not going to see adoption at the level that you would need to see in order for the companies to scale at the rate you expect them to scale. And so a regulatory environment that helps people feel like the technology is safe is actually critical to market adoption. So do not believe the people who are spouting, sort of this line that we have to operate it in a deregulated environment so that we can sort of win this race to China without sort of explaining what we are racing to or for, or how sort of winning the race sort of ends something like we get to some end state where development sort of stops and China is not going to continue to build technology that may, pass us or whatever. So I mean, what they are doing there is trying to create the space that they can further entrench their monopolies and lock other people out, and hope that the government that they, have purchased essentially is going to protect them from any of the fallout. They'll be too big to fail, and the investors in those large companies, the founders of those large companies will walk away fine. Meanwhile, everybody else who has to operate in this environment is not going to do so well. So I think that there's just a lot of like undercurrent of risk that this sort of hype, zeitgeist is obscuring, and it's really important for prudent investors to be aware that regulation actually creates long-term sustainable investing opportunities. It doesn't undermine it.
100% agree. Audrey, you have anything to add to that?
No, that was beautifully said. And the only thing I will add is that I encourage the investors that I work with to get involved in the policy discussion, because it's really important that the voice of longer term, more impact-oriented investors is heard, countering the voice coming from these AI boosters that Catherine referenced, who are really aggressively selling this narrative that any kind of regulation is antithetical to innovation. And so, yeah, I will leave it at that, but I completely agree.
Okay, and I think another question that I have is like, how do you guys think about training data and bias for some of these models, right? So as investors, how do we separate the question, separate we take this seriously versus from just a press release from, a random company? Like, how do you guys think about that?
So you mean, as an investor, how do you evaluate whether a portfolio company is taking model bias
Yes,
seriously?
seriously, yes.
Yeah, I think really they should have a strong understanding of what the problem is, and really strong governance installed. So they should have people right up to the board level that understand the problem, that ideally understand AI and data governance. There should be a specific expertise, and there should be a direct line into the risk committee of that company. And that kind of speaks to kind of larger companies that have a board that operates that way. But even at the startup level, there should be constant output validation, constant testing, constant red teaming to make sure that the outcomes are matching what the expectations are, and that they have people within the team that have the expertise, whether it's in human rights or civil rights or other kinds of backgrounds, that can actually look at those outcomes and kind of understand what the implications might be for users and other affected stakeholders. So you really want to see that combination of expertise and governance and just kind of constant auditing.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, none of these companies know. I'd say the one company that is, I think making a good faith effort to try to understand this is Anthropic, and even they will tell you they don't know what's going on under the hood. Um, there are parallels in, so, sort of civil rights law relies on a concept called disparate impact, where, you can't know what's going on in somebody's head if they made a decision, to rent to somebody or not based on bias all of the time, but you can detect patterns. Are the patterns that this landlord are producing are creating a sort of disparate impact against certain groups? You can do the same thing with AI, and we're actually sponsoring a bill in California that would do just that for high risk areas of people's lives: healthcare, housing, education, the criminal justice system, where bias is most likely to show up. And it's getting an enormous amount of pushback from industry, and not just the tech industry, but the healthcare industry, which is intent on using these tools with no accountability in the healthcare space. So there's just a lot of sort of uh, you know pressure on regulators to not address these issues. But again, like I would say, there's already laws against some of this stuff, and so it doesn't eliminate the risk or exposure that the people who are using these tools have for, following civil rights laws, for example.
Totally understand. And so, just one thing, we had a question that said, "What does it mean if Anthropic doesn't know what's going on under the hood itself?" So, I know what you're saying, but maybe just elaborate for the group in case is unclear.
Well, I mean, they can't really say why its systems do what they do. And they have done a lot of research to sort of get under the hood and see why it is making certain connections. But there's still a lot to be learned about how the actual output of a large language model, for example, is generated. Why is it choosing to, provide certain answers over others? Why, when you tune it in a certain way, does it, I think there's an example that I don't fully understand the technology of, but maybe, Audrey or Lawrence, you do, with Grok, where Elon tried to turn down the sort of wokeness meter. And it's sort of, and Grok degenerated into Mecha Hitler. So, there are ways that the tools are operating internally that are producing these outcomes that the companies who are building them don't fully understand. And honestly, that's sort of by design. I mean, they expect that sort of, generative AGI, artificial general intelligence, will operate, as human intelligence does. And in the same way that, I can't predict what Lawrence is about to say, it can't necessarily predict what these tools are going to say. And that's sort of a feature as far as they're concerned and not a bug. So again, like we do need better tools to audit these systems and look under the hood and understand what's going on. But also in the meantime, we can just look at the effect they're having on the world and hold them accountable to that.
I think that makes a ton of sense. Another question I have for both of you guys is something that we slightly touched on, but I don't know if we got specifics. Was kind of like what are meaningful guardrails for long-term value? So, like, what kinds of regulations should long-term investors actually welcome? So, we were talking about investors should be looking at, different pieces like but just having a better understanding, data, all different types of mechanisms. But like if you were an investor and you were to say like, I'm trying to learn this quick, I want to have like a five-piece checklist for how to make sure that the companies that we're investing into are actually, using these models safely and effectively. Like, how would you kind of answer that question?
Go ahead, Audrey.
I was going to say, I mean, Catherine is far more the policy expert than I am. But, I think at a starting level from the investor perspective is better disclosure from these companies, because right now the disclosure is pretty weak. And there are some efforts kind of in the ether that are going to try to create better frameworks so that companies can speak to investors on the methods that they're taking to make their AI more responsible and reduce the risk. But generally speaking, like, there's a lot of putative regulation going on, a lot of litigation you may have been reading about. And ultimately, we don't really know what the liability regime undergirding all of this will be. We don't really know who's going to be responsible for what. And the general thinking is that the AI companies are not going to have the benefit of Section 230 like the platforms did. And for those who don't know, Section 230 of the, sorry, I'm Canadian, so I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it's Communications Decency Act or something like that. Basically,
You know more about American policy than I know about Canadian policy. So
true. That's probably true. But it essentially meant that the platforms didn't have to. They were essentially indemnified from anything that anyone posted and or said on their platform. But I think with the AI falsehoods, like what Catherine was referring to, the fact that these models, euphemistically hallucinate. I think understanding who holds the responsibility for that. If a model defames someone and I say, ChatGPT, I integrate it into an AI tool that my company uses and it ends up defaming my biggest client, costing me millions of dollars, who is responsible for those millions of dollars? Is it me as the deployer? Is it OpenAI as the model developer? I think, as investors, we really want to understand where that legal liability is going to sit. And so ideally, any kind of policy regime would kind of clarify that and do it in a way that doesn't just kind of blindly benefit the model developers the way that Section 230 kind of blindly benefited the platforms.
yeah, and I'll say, like, in the absence of there being laws on the books that clarify that kind of thing, they're going to be decided in the courts. And, that's expensive for companies to get to an answer. So, from a sort of exposure and diligence perspective, that's another reason why, having really clear rules of the road is actually, something that investors really need to see what the risks actually are. I would say in terms of the policy environment we're broadly driving for, there's sort of two or three principles that are most important. The first one I would say is just in general, making sure that humans remain in control of the technology, that they have some agency in how it is used in their lives and deployed into society, and that when it is used, there is always a human that is sort of overseeing what's going on or accountable at the end of the day. So, what does that look like? It means that people should know when AI is being used in one of these high risk areas of their lives, as we have talked about. Um, we should have, notice of, if an AI is making a decision when it comes to healthcare, and we should have some understanding about how to pursue a claim against an AI actor if we feel like it has wronged us in some way. And there should be an accountability regime. So again, like this, going back to what Audrey was just saying, like clearly delineating who is ultimately accountable when harm occurs and where liability lays is really important for creating markets that work. And then the second really big piece, I think, is this corporate power question. It's not explicitly a technology issue, but I think that venture capital and the tech industry have really accelerated this sort of move towards monopoly power. And we're going to have reckon with some really big questions about what that means. I think, and I think this is a controversial statement, that we really need to start investigating what it would mean to nationalize the models themselves. I think they are sort of the equivalent of the backbone of the internet. And on some level, that infrastructure has been sort of nationalized, or at least is sort of built enough sort of openness and public access is built into the structure of that infrastructure. That would mean companies like ChatGPT and Anthropic could still build their products on top of these models they've created, but they wouldn't actually be responsible for the models themselves. I think that's something we should really start to look at in order to create more, agency and opportunity for startups and entrepreneurs to build companies that are really going to work on infrastructure that is not wholly owned by a handful of companies.
That makes a ton of sense. I like that. So what that also drew me to kind of a different question. Do you guys know like what the typical, which was around accountability? So do you guys know what the typical board makeup of an AI company is, and like whether or not you see that particular makeup as a problematic issue?
I could say off the top of my head who's on OpenAI's board. It's not particularly diverse, but they are sort of unique in that they're a nonprofit, or at least on paper, a nonprofit. Happy to happy to talk more about what that actually means. I do think, though, that it is notable that both OpenAI and Anthropic, which are the two startups in the space that sort of, were born of the AI era, not companies that already existed that are now adopting it. Both of them came out of the gates, being clear that they needed to adopt a bespoke governance structure, because they really believed that the technology they were building was too dangerous to be done by a traditional venture-backed corporation. And they have, if you look at how sort of Byzantine these governance structures are, they don't look like anything else that any other tech company, you might recognize, has employed. Um, and that should tell us something about what they believe they are building. And I think it is also really sobering and maybe scary that OpenAI has decided to sort of dissolve, from an operational, practical perspective, their nonprofit governance, and move forward as a traditional startup that is planning to go public by the end of the year. I mean, that is it says a lot about the influence that investors have had on their development, and I think is a really important object lesson in the limits of governance to protect from these other economic forces that are at play.
So just to follow up on that, I know that that's why Elon Musk actually sued OpenAI, and we have a question about what the non-profit structure actually looks like. So maybe if you could expound on that a little bit, about why nonprofit and
Yeah,
just.
I mean, I'm deep in the weeds on this. We're still sort of working to ensure that nonprofit, and everything that comes along with being a nonprofit is actually enforced on the company. And so I apologies in advance if this is like too arcane, and please pull me back out if it gets inscrutable. But they started as a nonprofit for the express purpose. Elon was one of the first funders, and he made a, tax deductible donation to the nonprofit to get it off the ground. It subsequently sort of decided that the company decided that if they were actually going to build what they wanted to build, they would need more money than they could raise through, nonprofit donations. And so they decided to create a for-profit company that was owned by the nonprofit that could take, sell equity stakes in that for-profit. That dynamic created, planted the seeds for an irreconcilable tension between investor incentives and the legal responsibility that the nonprofit has to operate in service of its nonprofit mission above all else. So in these moments where, the profit motivation or investor expectations is in tension with the safety concerns that the nonprofit should be advancing, the legally the nonprofit mission should override those profit motivations. Obviously, that didn't happen, and those who are following this know that in 2023, Sam Altman got fired by the nonprofit board because he was not living up to the mission. And then that board was dissolved under heavy pressure from investors. Altman was rehired, and they made this plan to sort of split the nonprofit from the for-profit. So I won't get into the details of how that advanced, but ultimately the attorneys general told them they could not split the nonprofit from the for-profit in the way that they wanted to. And so OpenAI ultimately decided to keep the nonprofit in control of the for-profit, at least legally on paper. But that really is, I mean, they're daring the AGs of California and Delaware, where they're incorporated, to hold them accountable to that. And every day they're operating in the way that they are, making deals with the Defense Department to build autonomous weapons and, surveil on American citizens. They are violating the nonprofit mission. And it is incumbent upon us to ensure that they are held accountable for that.
I agree. Audrey, you have anything there?
No, I mean, I think Catherine covered it very well. I'm not, I have to say, I'm not super familiar with the boards of the frontier model developers very well, but Open Mic has been engaging on the alongside some of our investor partners with AI deployers. So, publicly traded companies that are doing these big AI build outs within their companies, and governance and board representation is a really big topic of discussion for us. And because this is such a nascent issue, it's always where we start. And we want to know that these big companies, as they're onboarding this brand new tool really into an organization that has, all kinds of stakeholders, has so much financial value, that there's someone at the board level that understands the technology and can ask the right questions and can kind of really oversee the risks. So I will say that that's a really important thing to look for if you're going to look at it, investing in a tech deployer.
I agree. So we talk a lot about risk management and maybe like a downside protection, but maybe let's talk a bit about the tools and what you might be using. So like which AI tools are you using or do you prefer, and like why did you choose them? And just your perspective on the different tools, maybe in a more positive light.
I use Claude. I would say I was using ChatGPT and Claude alongside each other for a while. The initial sort of moved and more ChatGPT on the free account for like personal stuff, just more like a search engine type function. Claude is our enterprise provider. I mean, honestly, we chose them because they are an enterprise provider and they sort of built themselves around that, and they offer really generous nonprofit discounts. I use it to as sort of a writing partner. I've set up a project within Claude into which I've sort of put all of my writing and then use it as sort of to bounce ideas off of to sort of shape the outline of a piece I want to write. And then once I create the first draft of that, I will put it into Claude and have a conversation with Claude about how to make it more compelling, how to make sure that it's structured in a way that's actually getting my point across. And then go back and forth on drafts with it. It does not draft for me, but I sort of let it see drafts and let it give me sort of editorial advice. Um, and then to copy edit. And then there are some dumb things like, a funder wants a two-page description of a program that we're working on. It's like, this is something Claude can really kick out for me pretty easily. Let me have Claude do the first draft and I'll edit it. There's definitely, use cases like that for Claude. I have found no good tools to build slides. So if anybody has suggestions, please let me know.
Gotcha. Uh, uh, well, Audrey, I'll give you a chance to follow up on that if you want.
I also use Claude, and I think for similar reasons as Catherine and at some similar use cases. Although I did have it build me, like it vibe coded me a Chrome extension that summarizes articles. So it helps me decide if I want to read them because I kind of get the bullet points of what they're about, which is kind of fun. I wish I could say that I did it for altruistic reasons, but I just kind of gravitated toward Claude. I felt like it understood my prompts a little bit better. The dual use and military applications of AI is an issue area that Open Mic works on quite a bit. And so, we, after kind of their Anthropic's choice to stand up to the Pentagon, although it's not, they're not, that doesn't make them a shining example of a responsible AI company. But I have to say, that at least at a very minimum is something that we want to see more from these AI companies, making sure that their terms of use are being respected, especially in such a highly sensitive area. So it made me proud to be a Claude user, but I chose it for other reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it seems like the zeitgeist kind of wants to make Anthropic the good guy. I know a lot of people personally who work at Anthropic and at OpenAI, and I think that there is, the DNA, Anthropic's DNA was really, built on the folks who worked at OpenAI and didn't think the company was taking safety seriously enough. And so they went and started a new company. But again, going back to this, one of the reasons why I think we should really take seriously the idea that we nationalize these models is that if you had asked me 3 years ago, I know Sam Altman personally. If you had asked me 3 years ago whether I thought they were sort of the good guy, I would have said yes. So I think it's really terrifying to think that, all of the potential, all that's standing between society and the potential really negative outputs of these technologies is one CEO's benevolent decisions is like not acceptable to me as somebody who believes in democracy. And if our sense that these, platforms should not be nationalized is that we don't want our government in control of them, that we don't want them to be the ones making the decisions, then I think we really need to investigate like what the problem that we actually are trying to solve here is that our democracy is broken. And the way to solve that is not to put the responsibility for governing these extremely powerful technologies in the hands of an unaccountable, handful of billionaires. So the government is also responsible for our nuclear arsenal. And there are certain people that I would prefer be in charge of that than others. But ultimately, the principle is democratic control. And if we don't like, how our democratic systems are governing these things, then we should fix our democratic systems.
Right. And so with that in mind, what do you think about the like ownership of your data within these systems, right? So like how do you process that when you put stuff into Claude or you put stuff into ChatGPT? Like, how do you think that they're doing with data security and you being able to own your own data just in general was one of the questions.
Yeah, there's settings that you can toggle so that they don't train on your data. I'm going to give a plug for, I don't know how many of you are familiar with DuckDuckGo, but they have a platform called Duck.ai and it's free. And it kind of sits on top of the major models and it allows you to use them in a fully private way. And so you can choose which underlying generative AI model you want to use. So you can choose Claude, but the interface is through this Duck.ai and they have all kinds of privacy protecting methods that I'm not technical enough to explain well to you, but that's my plug for duck.ai.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's notable that we have not had any national privacy regulations since Reagan um, made it illegal for, Blockbuster Video to share what movies you were renting. So, I mean, given the technological innovation since then, I think that's really notable, and it says a lot about how successful the tech industry's lobbying efforts have been. There are some state level privacy regulations. California has one. They don't fully account for the AI era. And actually, we just went through a rulemaking process in California around that, in which the industry really was successful at watering down the regulations that sort of govern that privacy legislation. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. And speaking of, legislation, we're now facing. It seems like the most sort of sustained, consistent thing coming out of Washington right now has been this desire to preempt all state level legislation on AI with basically nothing. So basically, not a preemption, a ban on state level AI legislation, and that's a huge threat also. So again, like the need for investors to be, I think investors, my sense is that investors don't necessarily think of themselves as political actors. I think in this space, you really need to reconsider that and think about how all of the stuff that Audrey and I have just talked about the political environment, the regulatory environment that is determining whether your investments are going to be successful in the long run or not, whether they are creating risk for your companies or not, is driven by this regulatory environment. And I promise you that if lawmakers were hearing from investors and saying, "Hey, this like lack of regulation is really making it harder for us to, deploy capital," then that would have an impact on the process. So, happy to talk with folks if you're interested about how to do that. But I really would just like start to consider what it means to take in the regulatory environment, the political environment as part of your overall investment thesis and your diligence process.
I agree. And so maybe from also, let's talk about the investors and not just the companies they're investing in, but themselves too, like as an individual. Do you think that they should have like an agent bot or something like that? Like, do you think that they should, be actively using this as well for, themselves?
I mean, one thing I'll say with agents is there are a lot of security concerns with it. And OpenMic put out an investor brief on AI privacy security. It kind of goes over this really well. But I think it was in December, Microsoft released the latest version of Copilot, and they actually included like a disclaimer on it saying, do not attach this to any of your very sensitive data on your computer, because these agents, like other forms of generative AI that they're kind of built on top of, they tend to hallucinate, they tend to misunderstand instructions, they can go a little bit haywire. And there's been, high profile examples of them deleting an entire stack of code, or, going into people's calendars and putting, harmful things into private emails. There's a lot of ways that these things can go wrong. And so just making sure that you have them properly sandboxed, and making sure that anything that is really sensitive, there's kind of a lot of guardrails around what you allow the agents to do. And happy to share that report if it's of interest.
Yeah, please do. I mean, I did see the kind of the trend about the Mac Mini and people just doing the Open AI, I mean the Claude thing just on a Mac Mini just by itself. But sorry, Catherine, I knew you were going to jump
Yeah,
in.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I'm not sure what exactly, like what useful things agents could do for you at this point, that don't create, at least as far as I'm concerned, an unacceptable security risk. Because, the whole point of having an agent is that it's offloading tasks from you, and that requires giving it credentials to, your accounts. It requires, providing a credit card information, like all of these things. And if it's coming back to you and asking every time for permission to do things, like what's the point? So we're really going to have to figure out what the use cases are here. Maybe it's a fun side project you're doing in a sandboxed environment, and it's helping you learn something about how AI works or giving you some ideas. But like beyond that, I mean, it doesn't feel like there's some meaningful value add that it's creating, at least for me, in what I would want to get off my plate.
Mhm. No, that makes a lot of sense. It's a little bit more of an experiment than, and the cost benefit analysis isn't exactly there for what you're saying for the risk case as of right now. So I get that. And then one more question was, how might investors understand infrastructure risks related to energy access, water resources, and local environmental impacts of AI they are invested in?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the sort of public trust in AI really comes in. I will say that uh, the water risks, as I understand them, are overblown. But the electricity costs are real and high. And, I think there are probably ways to mitigate that so it doesn't come back to, individual ratepayers, but people are right to be concerned. I think more than those issues, though, the data centers are a physical manifestation of the unease that people feel around the technology itself. And the way that people feel about social media, there isn't like a physical place in the world that people can go to like make clear how they feel about the tool itself. The data centers provide a physical place for people to coalesce, a thing for people to sort of project their anger onto. And I think the more people don't trust the technology and the people who are building the technology, the more you're going to see people take it out on the data center process. Whether you think in the context of the data center that is a rational thing to do or not, it is becoming an organizing environment. So again, that sort of lack of regulatory control over the technology, the sense of this lack of accountability that the people who are building the tools have, and this concentration of power are ultimately working against, everyday investors. And so if you want to see the temperature get turned down, if you want to see the technology sort of develop faster, I think it's really important that people be supporting regulation that will create trust in the market, that allows this infrastructure to get built responsibly.
And one thing I'll add is that, I think disclosure on this is really important. The hyperscalers have not adapted their climate disclosure to all of the data center built out. And there's been a lot of misrepresentations in the types of energy sources, in offsets, and in absolute emissions coming from these data centers. And so I think, a first order question on that is just to understand what the actual impacts are and making sure that there's kind of clear and measurable disclosure. And then, I think there's also an opportunity to think outside the current paradigm, which it feels exactly like Catherine described. Like there's a lot of community opposition, almost, I started my career in kind of broader business and human rights, where I worked with a lot of extractive sector companies. And this feels almost similar to that, where communities don't like that there is this, corporate entity coming in and taking up all their resources and causing all these externalities. But there are some data center companies that are starting to think about things differently, and actually be kind of accretive to the communities that they come into. And I think it's really important that companies know that this is an option, that they can actually, help build roads, that they can fortify local power grids, that they can improve internet connectivity. In Finland, there's a town, I think, that's gets like 70% of its heat from data centers in the winter. And so I think that's a combination of the companies thinking outside the box, but then also the local officials being involved in the process and making sure that they're representing the needs of their communities over the needs of these AI companies.
Yeah. So another question coming in, what is the value add for an entrepreneur when starting a business with AI, right? So I guess from how it was maybe say 10 years ago versus now, um, how does it, make the process easier, make them maybe scale quicker? Um, if you were to just say like what do you think the overall value add is with accurately utilizing AI for an entrepreneur today?
And it's hard to say because I think it really depends on what their field of work is. But I think it reduces the kind of baseline need for technical skills. Like I said, I was able to kind of vibe code something that helps me in my work. But the big caveat to that is, of course, the security concerns, where like it is very easy to vibe code something that looks good in practice, but you have no idea how secure that code is. And so I think there's always these kinds of internal tensions when you rely too strongly on AI. But I think another way that it could be helpful is just it's a very good information aggregator, and you can learn quite a bit about a wide range of topics, if you know how to use it correctly. But again, the trade-off is that a lot of that information is not necessarily accurate, and you have to know how to prompt it to make sure that you are getting information from proper sources. And so, yeah, it's a trade-off. I think it can help in some ways as long as we're aware of what the limitations are.
100%. And then the last question I think I'll take in is, if investors want to enter this area, what do you recommend they prioritize in diligence and advocacy?
Well, I'll take the advocacy side and maybe Audrey can take the diligence side. I mean, I would say the first and easiest thing you could do is call your representative and tell them that you don't support the federal government preempting statewide laws. I think most of you are in Pennsylvania. Um, the governor has actually adopted some really important state level AI standards that I think are really interesting. You could let the state know that you're glad they are doing that. I mean, one thing that we find, and I know it's sort of cheesy to say, call your representatives as the only thing you can do. But what we have found working on this issue with elected officials is that they do not, this is starting to change, but by and large, over the past few years, they have not seen this as an issue that any of their voters actually care about. And so their consideration when they're deciding whether to, vote for a regulation or not is that the companies are in their ear telling them, hey, this is going to cost jobs or whatever it is. And they don't feel like they have the space to do something different. And so when they're hearing from their constituents, that really changes the dynamic. And investors have such a outsized, disproportionate amount of power in that sense, because it's not just some crank that's calling, it's somebody who's calling to say, hey, you're hearing from industry that this is going to cost jobs if you regulate. But what I'm seeing is that it's actually going to cost jobs for us not to regulate. And that has a huge amount of power. So the single most important thing you can do is start to understand your political power and to use it effectively. And if folks have more specific questions on how to deploy that, I'm happy to share my contact information and have a conversation with you about it.
Awesome. Thank you. Anything, Audrey?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And one thing in due diligence to look for is, to the extent you can ask these portfolio companies, is are they participating in the lobbying against regulation? Because there is a whole kind of cohort of AI boosters and portfolio companies that are paying into these lobbying efforts to reduce guardrails being put in place. So that's an easy question to start with. But I'll just kind of summarize some of the things I said earlier: good governance, data provenance, security and privacy, and some attempts at participatory design, making sure that the end users or affected stakeholders have some say in how the technology is designed and deployed.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So yeah, I think this has been a great session. Corey, I think we're going to wrap up here, but I appreciate everybody's attendance. I thought this was a very, insightful and hopefully was a helpful session. And I'm happy you came. Corey, any words?
No, thanks everyone for being here, and we'll make the video available on the website in about a week or so, and we'll send you an email when that's up there. So thanks, Audrey and Catherine, for lending us your knowledge, and thanks for moderating, Lawrence.